Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is to take these complex, often overwhelming sources and, well, distill them into the essential knowledge you need.
And hopefully we can give you some of those surprising facts that just stick with you long after the conversation is over.
Today, we are undertaking a particularly challenging deep dive.
It is. It's one that really requires you to hold two completely opposing historical narratives in your mind at the same time.
We're digging into the documents, the research, and the, let's say, critical literature surrounding the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations.
TAHR, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And depending on who you ask, Tavistock is either this revered pioneer in mental health and group dynamics, a pillar of modern psychology.
Or, as a very significant body of counter-literature alleges, it is the intellectual nerve center for a massive, decades-long project of global social engineering.
It's the ultimate case of a bifurcated history, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Our sources lay out such a clear contrast. On one hand, you have the conventional history of, geopolitics, economics, technology.
And on the other, this parallel, almost hidden history that's focused entirely on psychological management.
And the systematic engineering of social consent.
So the central question we're trying to get to the bottom of, based on the material, is this. Was Tavistock primarily about healing trauma?
Or did the techniques they developed for curing, say, an individual's neuroses get repurposed and scaled up to manage the collective psyche of entire nations?
We're going to contrast the institutes, their undeniable academic contributions.
Well, you can't deny them.
No. We'll contrast those with these extensive claims that their ultimate objective kind of shifted from clinical therapy to, the design of a predictable, manageable global society.
And that alleged shift in focus from cure to control it ties directly back to a concept coined by Edward Bernays.
Sigmund Freud's nephew, famously.
The very same. Bernays basically provided the philosophical rationale. He argued that the manipulation of the masses isn't just possible, but actually necessary in a democratic society.
The engineering of consent.
That's the phrase. And if Bernays gave us the justification for it, the Tavistock network, according to its critics, provided the operational lab.
So they turned these, philosophical PR concepts into concrete, repeatable techniques you could actually use on a whole society.
That's the allegation. That's our mission today. To trace the lineage of those tools from the battlefield clinic all the way to the boardrooms and maybe the halls of government.
To understand the gravity of these accusations, we have to start at the beginning. We have to anchor ourselves in the undeniable, legitimate origins of the Institute.
And that origin story is one of, tragedy and necessity. It starts in the horrific trenches of World War I.
Mechanized slaughter on a scale nobody had ever seen.
And it broke the human mind just as efficiently as it broke bodies. The sheer scale of shell shock, what they called war neuroses, it was a psychological epidemic.
The sources describe soldiers suffering from, severe tremors, paralysis, blindness, mutism.
And often with no physical wound to explain any of it. It was baffling to the doctors of the time.
It just shattered the old 19th century military paradigm.
It did. Because initially, the British High Command, they just dismissed these symptoms as simple cowardice.
A lack of moral fiber. They tried to shame men back into battle.
But you can't shame away a tidal wave. The sheer number of casualties, we're talking tens of thousands of men psychologically collapsed, made it impossible to ignore.
And that crisis forced a revolutionary paradigm shift in how we understand psychology.
The leaders had to realize that the breakdown wasn't necessarily a failure of the individual soldier. It was a rational, though obviously pathological, response to a completely irrational and toxic environment.
Every man has a breaking point.
Every single one. And that realization is really the birth of what we call social psychiatry.
Meaning if the environment is the source of the sickness,
then treating the individual in a vacuum is, it's insufficient. You have to treat the environment, or at the very least, recognize its massive influence.
So this is what drove the founding of the Tavistock Clinic.
In Bloomsbury, London, September 1920, it was founded by a Dr. Hugh Crichton Miller.
And it was revolutionary for its time, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It offered modern, holistic psychotherapeutic treatments pro bono to veterans and the general population. It focused squarely on that link between individual neurosis and environmental stress.
So its foundation was really a compassionate humanitarian effort to deal with mass trauma.
It was. But the clinical work started to reveal this powerful insight. Individual mental illness was often just a symptom of group disintegration.
Or environmental stress. It wasn't just a faulty mechanism in one person's brain.
Exactly. It was inextricably linked to their social network, to their environment.
And that insight, that the social environment determines psychological health, that's the seed, right? That's the seed of all the later, more controversial applications.
It's the core idea. If changing social conditions can cure, then designing social conditions can, theoretically, manage or even condition an entire population.
And this concept was then tested, expanded, and really industrialized during the Second World War.
Which critics of Tavistock refer to as Operation Phoenix.
The ultimate large-scale laboratory for applying these psychological concepts to the masses.
Right. Tavistock psychiatrists became absolutely central to the British Army's operations, especially in psychological warfare and, crucially, personnel selection.
This is the moment where, it seems, clinical diagnosis rapidly turns into a form of social engineering.
It really is. The challenge of selecting, training, and maintaining morale in a massive army required psychological solutions, not just military ones. And the key innovation here was something called the War Office Selection Boards.
The WOSBs.
The WOSBs.
Okay, so wait a minute. Putting people in a leaderless group to see who steps up, I mean, that sounds like pretty standard leadership training today. How was that so revolutionary back then?
That's a crucial question. It was revolutionary because it completely abandoned the centuries-old reliance on social class, a person's background, their academic history.
Who your father was.
Exactly. The WSBs operationalized this concept of group functionality. Instead of judging a man's individual attributes in an interview, they were observed over several days in dynamic, leaderless group exercises.
Can you give us an example? What were they actually doing?
Sure. They'd present a group of candidates with a technical or physical challenge, like, say, crossing a hypothetical river with just a few pieces of equipment.
A classic team-building exercise.
Right. But the observers, who were often trained psychiatrists, they weren't just looking at who solved the puzzle. They were watching how the group functioned under pressure, who supported the weaker members, who took charge but failed to listen, who subtly undermined the group's cohesion.
So they were measuring the emotional and social dynamics of the group itself.
Precisely. They were defining a good candidate as someone who made the unit stronger, not just someone who was individually smart or brave. They were selecting individuals based on their fit within a social system.
Predicting their success not as an individual machine, but as a component in a larger system.
You've got it. It was the earliest large-scale application of modern group dynamics, transforming recruitment from an assessment of character to an assessment of, functional utility within a system.
But the real hinge point, the moment that critics cite over and over as the intellectual foundation for mass control, came with the Northfield experiments.
Ah, yes, Northfield.
What made that so significant?
Well, the Northfield Military Hospital housed soldiers who were suffering from psychological trauma, but instead of the traditional model, a paternalistic doctor treating a passive patient.
The whole hospital was turned into what they called a therapeutic community.
Exactly. The soldiers themselves were given responsibility for the day-to-day running of the hospital. They organized entertainment, they set up internal governance systems.
They created a micro-society within the hospital walls.
They did. And the profound realization was that the environment itself, this self-governing, active, supportive community, that was the therapeutic agent.
The environment was the curriculum.
If you design an environment that promotes health and stabilization, the patients will start to self-regulate and heal faster.
This feels like a critical transition. It elevates the science from just managing sick individuals to, managing the healthy collective.
That's the leap. The psychological tools developed to stabilize a traumatized soldier could, in theory, be used to condition a citizen for peacetime society.
Morale, discipline, cohesion. These all became technical problems that you could solve with psychological design.
And this is the expertise that then transitioned into peacetime. In 1946, with a lot of funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was formally incorporated.
And the stated goal was benign, academic.
Completely. To apply the advanced social science learned during the war to solve post-war societal issues.
But this is where the conventional story and the conspiracy thesis they diverge completely.
Right. Critics like John Coleman claim this wasn't a benign transition at all, but a calculated redeployment.
The allegation being that the founders, who were now used to this immense power of psychological management over military populations, believed they knew better than the public how society should be structured.
And the target, according to these sources, shifted from breaking enemy morale to managing, and I quote, the soul of the American people, or the Western world in general.
So the sophisticated tools of psychological warfare, originally used to defeat authoritarian regimes.
Were now allegedly available to corporate and governmental clients for things like managing worker unrest, a huge post-war fear, and systematically shaping public opinion.
It's the critique that the fear of a return to totalitarianism or mass chaos, fueled by the memory of two world wars, provided the perfect justification for control.
The founders and the moneyed interests supposedly backing them believed that psychologically stabilizing the masses was necessary to guarantee democracy.
Which ironically results in a kind of friendly fascism.
A system where democratic consent isn't organic, but is expertly engineered from the top down. Stability becomes the overriding value, justifying the use of these incredibly powerful psychological techniques on everyone.
Now we have this tool, born of necessity and trauma, that can either heal or condition. We have to explore the specific academic theories that critics claim are the operational blueprint for mass manipulation.
And we have to start with Kurt Lewin.
A towering figure in social psychology.
Absolutely. He profoundly influenced Tavistock with his work on group dynamics and action research. He even coined the term social engineering, though he meant it as a collaborative democratic process.
Okay, but the sources we're looking at, they zoom in on his three-stage model of change.
A model taught in basically every modern business school.
But here, it's interpreted as the timeline for mass social control. So let's break down those stages. What's stage one?
The first stage is unfreezing. This is absolutely critical. You cannot change a system that is stable and comfortable. Unfreezing requires a destabilizing force, a shock, that's severe enough to overwhelm all the existing defense mechanisms and habits.
So the goal is to introduce anxiety, cognitive dissonance, to shake the very ground the system is built on.
Precisely. In a clinical setting, this shock might be a therapist's harsh confrontation to break through denial. In a societal application, critics argue this shock is a major economic crisis, a sudden cultural revolution, a manufactured political scandal.
Or an unexpected military conflict. The key is that the event has to bypass critical thinking and generate immediate, widespread confusion.
Right. It's about creating a state of psychological fatigue, a population too tired to resist.
And once you have the system in that state of maximum fluidity, what happens next?
That leads directly to the second stage, changing. This is the malleable fluid period. The old structures have collapsed, defense mechanisms are down, and people are desperately seeking a new framework to make sense of the chaos.
This is when people are most suggestible.
The most suggestible. They're open to accepting entirely new behaviors or structures that they would have just rejected out of hand before.
And then you lock it in with the third stage, refreezing.
Yes. The new state is stabilized. It's reinforced by new social norms, new laws, new economic structures, until it becomes the new unchallengeable normal.
So the conspiracy thesis argues that this model explains the perpetual state of crisis in modern society. Why would the alleged controllers want to keep the system from ever properly refreezing?
Because if the system refreezes into a stable, healthy democracy, the population might regain its critical faculties, its political strength.
So by manufacturing or just exploiting perpetual cultural shocks, financial bubbles, energy crises, social polarization.
You keep the system in a permanent state of unfreezing. It stays fluid. The population remains malleable, suggestible, always waiting for the next structure to be imposed from the top down by experts who promise to solve the chaos.
Which completely bypasses the slower, messier democratic process.
It's not always about making a specific change right now. It's about maintaining the readiness for change, so that when the technocratic elite decides on a new policy, the population is already psychologically prepared to accept it out of sheer exhaustion.
So if Lewin gave them the timeline for how to break a structure, it was Wilfred Bion who gave them the emotional levers.
Bion's work on group dynamics is utterly foundational. His revolutionary insight was that groups operate on two levels at the same time.
The first is the visible, rational level.
The work group, which is task-oriented, but beneath that, there's the unconscious, emotional, irrational, basic assumption group.
And this is like the hidden wiring of mass emotion, right? The stuff that often overrides any rational purpose.
Exactly. And Bion identified three specific, deeply rooted emotional assumptions that, when triggered, drive a group into highly irrational behavior. These are the exploitable states.
Let's detail them. First one is dependency.
In a state of dependency, the group basically retreats into an infantile, passive mindset. They demand a paternalistic leader, a government, a state, to provide salvation and clear direction. They avoid responsibility.
Which is perfect for technocratic control. A dependent population is a grateful, compliant population.
Then you have fight-flight. This is triggered by a perceived external threat. The group unites in blind, non-critical action, either to attack a common enemy or to flee from a shared fear.
So this is the psychological basis for war propaganda, the strategy of tension.
You just need to keep generating external enemies or existential threats, a foreign power, a virus, climate catastrophe, to keep the group unified and mobilized, all while bypassing any critical look at the internal situation. The energy is all pointed outwards.
And a final assumption.
Caring. In this state, the group waits passively for some future messianic event, a savior, a new idea that will magically solve all their problems.
And according to the sources, this pairing state is used to divert political energy.
Yes. Instead of organizing politically, instead of engaging in real-world activism, the population's energy is channeled into, say, utopian movements or philosophical introspection or self-indulgent fantasy. It's incredibly effective at preventing unified, practical political action.
It's powerful how these diagnostic tools, which are still used in organizational therapy to figure out why a board meeting is going off the rails,
Can be interpreted as a clear, detailed instruction manual for state-level psychological manipulation. It's the difference between a doctor using a scalpel to heal and someone else using it to harm.
And this brings us to Trist and Emery, who define the kind of environment you'd need to keep people in this perpetual state of unfreezing.
They called it the Type 5 environment, a turbulent environment.
The future shocks thesis. What exactly is a turbulent environment?
It's the most complex and unstable environment they identified. It's defined by high uncertainty and a rapid acceleration of change. Everything is so interconnected that small actions, small shocks can have massive, unpredictable global consequences.
The ground itself is in motion.
That's the key. The rules, the structures, the norms, they're all constantly changing.
That sounds remarkably like life in the 21st century.
It absolutely does. And the allegation is that the Tavistock network, through groups like the Science Policy Research Unit, didn't just study this turbulence, but actively sought to create and maintain it.
The weaponization of turbulence.
Yeah.
Why? What's the ultimate objective of subjecting a society to that?
The theory is that by subjecting the collective psyche to a rapid, relentless succession of traumatic, disorienting events, energy crises, cultural battles, financial crashes, the population reaches a state of sensory overload.
And when the mind can no longer process all that change.
The resulting population retreats into either profound apathy or, in extreme cases, a kind of mass psychosis. They're too exhausted, confused, and demoralized to resist. This makes them easier to manage and far more willing to surrender autonomy for the simple promise of order.
An order delivered by a centralized technocratic government.
Which provides the full theoretical architecture. Lewin gives you the phases. Unfreeze, change, refreeze. Bion gives you the emotional triggers. Dependency, fight-flight, pairing. And Trist and Emery define the environment. Turbulence.
Okay, so now we have to connect these psychological theories to the grand strategic claims of global manipulation detailed in our sources.
We have to go back to Bernays' initial principle. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses.
It's the ultimate expression of control without coercion, isn't it? The mid-20th century shift identified by critics is just fundamental.
It is. The idea that the elite had mastered the production of physical goods during the Industrial Revolution. Now the goal allegedly turned to the production of reality itself.
Moving from command and control, which just breeds resistance,
To social engineering. The objective being what Aldous Huxley described in Brave New World, making the population love their servitude. They comply because the system has been psychologically engineered to satisfy their immediate managed desires.
And this is where critics often point to Tavistock's involvement in industrial research, like the Glacier Metals Project.
Right. Officially, that was about industrial democracy and optimizing production. Critics, however, view it as a testing ground for psychologically integrating the worker into the corporate system.
A blueprint for modern human resources.
Exactly. The goal wasn't just to make the worker more efficient, but to break their identification with their trade or their class. Using concepts like autonomous work groups to ensure the worker's psychological allegiance was firmly held by the corporation, not a union.
Which brings us to the biggest, most sensational claim in this entire body of literature.
The Committee of 300 allegation.
According to highly critical sources, most notably John Coleman, The Tavistock Institute doesn't operate in isolation.
It operates as the psychological warfare arm, the brain, of a supranational entity known as the Committee of 300.
And this group is claimed to be made up of European nobility, American financial dynasties.
The Rockefellers, the Morgans, all allegedly working toward a centralized, technocratic, one-world government.
So in this alleged command structure, Tavistock designs the psychological operation, but they need implementation nodes, a body, to deploy these designs globally.
Yes, and the sources name several key partners in this network. First among them is the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, in California.
And their job was.
SRI was allegedly tasked with focusing on soft power and cultural transformation, specifically guiding the radical shifts in Western values during the latter half of the 20th century, setting the stage for what would be called the Aquarian conspiracy.
Okay, next up, the Club of Rome. Officially, they're a high-level think tank focused on resource limits and sustainability.
The critical view asserts they were established specifically to create the global crisis narrative. Their famous report, The Limits to Growth, is cited by critics as a mechanism designed to promote the narrative of overpopulation, resource depletion, and environmental collapse.
All to justify the deindustrialization of the West and the implementation of global centralized resource management.
Exactly. It provides the economic and environmental justification for bypassing national sovereignty and democratic control.
And then there's the Institute for Policy Studies, IPS.
Mentioned as the organization responsible for shaping specific national and international political policies to align with this centralized agenda.
And finally, the distribution node, the mechanism for mass saturation that ensures the public is exposed to the designed reality.
The mainstream media, which is chillingly described in this literature as the mighty Wurlitzer.
That's an evocative term.
It is a giant organ that plays the tunes, the propaganda narratives, and cultural shocks composed by Tavistock's brain, ensuring the consistent shaping of global perception and public opinion day after day across every channel.
It paints a picture of a comprehensive architecture of engineered consent.
Yeah.
Intellectual design, economic justification, political policy, and mass psychological dissemination.
To really grasp the scope of these claims, we need to apply this theoretical blueprint to a specific period of massive social change.
The 1960s counterculture.
Exactly. Conventionally, we see this as a spontaneous, organic youth uprising against stifling social norms and the Vietnam War.
But the conspiracy thesis offers a very, very different interpretation.
That the counterculture was a manufactured psychological operation, a psyop on a global scale.
The ultimate application of Lewin's unfreezing phase.
The argument is that it was engineered not only to neutralize the increasingly powerful anti-war movements, but also to destroy the moral fiber of the West, paving the way for a new, globalized, consumption-focused society.
So how is the concept of the Aquarian conspiracy interpreted through this cynical lens?
Well, Marilyn Ferguson's original book described a positive, benign network of individuals working for a collective shift in consciousness. Critics argue this network was actively managed by SRI and Tavistock.
The goal being to usher in a post-Christian, hedonistic, and irrational cultural era, the Age of Aquarius.
An era where individualism and self-absorption would replace civic responsibility and traditional morality.
What was the fundamental economic goal behind this alleged cultural shift?
The objective was to transform the American economy. The sources claim the aim was to shift the U.S. from an industrial producer society, which was rational, future-oriented, based on the Protestant ethic of deferred gratification,
to a consumer hedonist society,
which is irrational, present-oriented, and focused on instant gratification and continuous consumption.
In other words, promoting mysticism and drug use was a mechanism to render the youth incapable of the rational, highly organized, long-term political resistance that had characterized previous revolutionary movements.
Precisely. It creates a generation focused entirely on their inner space, on personal feelings, leaving the external world politics, finance, infrastructure free for technocratic management.
This leads us to perhaps the most controversial claim in all this material, the role of the Beatles and the Frankfurt School philosopher Theodor Adorno.
The specific claim detailed in Coleman's writings is that the Beatles were not a spontaneous phenomenon, but a carefully designed cultural shock introduced by the Tavistock network.
The goal being to initiate this mass unfreezing process in the youth.
Right. And the connection to Adorno is jarring, to say the least. given his historical intense intellectual disdain for pop culture.
And his association with classical Marxism. How on earth do critics connect him to writing pop music?
The allegation is that Adorno was enlisted, or his psychological theories were utilized, to design the very structure of popular music. Specifically, the atonal and discordant elements in rock, along with the heavy, insistent beat, to induce a state of fragmentation in the listener's psyche.
Fragmentation, a breaking down of cognitive and psychological structures.
The proposed mechanism is that the heavy beat and volume mimic hypnotic or excitatory tribal drumming, bypassing the rational mind and generating a state of mass psychological contagion.
The hysteria of Beatlemania.
Is cited as direct evidence of the successful, deliberate induction of this state. The Beatles were the Trojan horse that opened the gate for drug culture and the systematic rejection of existing moral values.
Okay, let's move from the music to the literal chemical catalyst of the counterculture, LSD and its link to intelligence operations like MKUltra.
The theory posits that the widespread, rapid distribution of LSD in the 60s wasn't a natural emergence, but was actively facilitated by various intelligence agencies.
Serving as the ultimate mass unfreezing agent in Lewin's model.
And the term depatterning is used here in the context of LSD abuse among the youth. Explain that concept.
Depatterning is linked to early CIA mind control research. The idea is to chemically and psychologically wipe existing, stable behavioral and moral patterns so that new ones can be installed or imprinted.
And LSD, used widely and indiscriminately by an entire generation, was seen as a way to chemically destabilize those existing moral and social patterns en masse.
So the widespread use of hallucinogens served a fundamental political function, neutralizing activism.
That is the crucial strategic critique. The powerful political energy from the Vietnam War and civil rights movement's energy that could have led to serious political change was diverted.
Instead of organizing, marching, or seizing the means of production.
The youth were encouraged to engage in individual, self-absorbed introspection, tuning in, turning on, and dropping out.
So the system effectively used the counterculture as a safety valve.
It allowed all that revolutionary frustration to be released through drug use and spiritual searching, rendering the political energy harmless. The technocrats were left in unthreatened control of the outer space of government, finance, and global policy.
This focus on fundamental structures leads us to the alleged ultimate goal of this entire social engineering project, the complete atomization of society by targeting the family unit.
And the premise here, from the critical perspective, is entirely structural. The family is the fundamental psychological fortress of the individual.
It provides identity, security, intergenerational values.
And a primary loyalty that naturally supersedes loyalty to the state. So to create a centralized global state that demands total loyalty, the family must first be dismantled as a rival center of authority.
Which is why these sources interpret the rise of feminism and other social movements not purely as organic liberation, but as movements that were deliberately co-opted.
They outline a very cynical dual objective. The first is economic. Encouraging women into the full-time workforce effectively doubled the state's tax base overnight,
Massively increasing government revenue and control.
and the second goal is social, focused on early indoctrination and weakening familial bonds.
The argument being that by prioritizing careers over child rearing, society necessarily requires large-scale, state-run childcare.
Which allows the state to begin the socialization and value shaping of children at a much earlier age, removing the crucial buffer of parental values during those formative years.
And critics also allege that the erosion of traditional father figures and stable marital structures removes the psychological protection of the family unit, leaving the individual exposed.
Precisely. The state then steps in as the functional surrogate parent, the paterfamilias, providing welfare, moral guidance via media and security.
Which perfectly fulfills Bayon's dependency group assumption on a national scale.
With the nuclear family weakened and society atomized into hyper-individualists, the individual naturally relies on the state for economic stability and psychological survival.
So the thesis is that high divorce rates, the promotion of non-traditional relationships, the pervasive sexualization of culture, these aren't just natural sociological shifts.
But engineered outcomes designed specifically to atomize society and destroy the psychological cohesion of the family structure. The goal is to ensure that the only stable, reliable relationships an individual maintains are with the state as a citizen and the corporation as a consumer.
We have spent a lot of time walking through both the legitimate history of clinical genius and these deeply unsettling claims of global manipulation.
Now we have to bring this deep dive full circle and revisit that bifurcated reality of the Tavistock Institute. We need to separate the academic giant from the alleged mythological puppeteer.
On the one hand, you have the legacy of the scientific Tavistock, and it's undeniable. It was a pioneer in treating trauma, instrumental in establishing the NHS's psychological services.
And its core figures, Bion, Lewin, Trist, are genuine giants of social science. Their work is sound and used daily in benign contexts, from team building to disaster relief.
And on the other side is the mythological Tavistock,
Mm.
the powerful, unseen entity at the heart of a global conspiracy, the destroyer of culture, the architect of modern malaise.
The brain for a shadowy global elite.
The power of this massive conspiracy theory, as our sources analyze it, is really sociological in its function. It provides a coherent, structured, and emotionally satisfying answer for that fundamental feeling of modern life.
The chaos, the dislocation, the sense that things are happening to you, that you're losing control.
It provides a terrifying but structured narrative for our post-industrial, hyper-turbulent society.
And we have to emphasize the reality of manipulation, regardless of whether a committee of 300 exists. The techniques themselves, mass marketing, PR, psychological nudging, crisis management, these are undeniably the tools of modern corporate and governmental power.
Bernays absolutely did champion the engineering of consent, and these mechanisms are used daily to manage public opinion and consumer behavior.
For instance, let's revisit the argument about the 1960s counterculture. Even if the claim that Adorno wrote pop music is, dubious and sensationalized.
The critique that the counterculture served as a cultural valve for capitalism is a sophisticated, acknowledged sociological argument.
Yes. Critical theorists like Herbert Marcuse recognize that the modern capitalist system is remarkably effective at absorbing and commodifying resistance. The system did turn revolutionary energy into highly profitable merchandise.
Neutralizing its political potential while simultaneously accelerating consumerism.
And finally, there's the ongoing relevance of Tristan Emery's work on the trauma of change. The accuracy of their concept of the turbulent environment is it's undeniable.
We live in a world of continuous, accelerating future shock. The ground is always shifting beneath our feet.
And the sources note that the conspiracy theory provides a crucial kind of comfort, the comfort of conspiracy.
How so?
If the chaos of the modern world is truly random, then humanity is just adrift, facing meaningless disasters. But if the Tavistock network is purposefully breaking the world, there is at least an intent, a plan, which is psychologically easier for the human mind to process than true randomness.
Ultimately, the history of the Institute is the history of the realization that the human mind isn't an isolated entity. It's a node in a network.
Vulnerable to the same systemic forces that affect organizations and armies. And the tools developed were built to do two things: to heal that network or to hack it.
The techniques, the psychological structures for managing groups and implementing systemic change, they're all codified and taught worldwide. The immediate relevance for you, the listener, is in recognizing when these structures are being applied.
The ability to recognize the dependency state, the fight-flight trigger, or the signs of unfreezing, that's the first essential step toward reclaiming critical thought, regardless of who you think is pulling the strings.
Given the prevalence of future shock and constant crisis management today, the key question for you is the ultimate question from Lewin's model. Are we currently in a state of continuous unfreezing, kept malleable by constant turbulence, waiting for the next structure to be imposed by those promising order?
Or are we, right now, actively refreezing the new structures and accepting them as the inevitable normal? What direction do you see the collective consensus moving in?
That is the deep dive into the architecture of influence. The choice to recognize the psychological structures at work is always your own. We'll see you next time for the next deep dive.